Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today is another episode of NBA Trade Machine, and this week is going to focus entirely on Marc Gasol and Mike Conley. As many of you know, within the past week or so, there have been a couple of reports saying that the franchise decided to move on from these two players and potentially trade them away in an effort to start the rebuild as their season has gone downhill pretty quickly. Other than that, the only difference in this week's episode is that I've gotten some feedback from some of you guys that you'd like to see my own opinions and some of my own trades in these videos a bit more. So to try and mix that together with the community suggestions, if I see a trade that someone came up with that's good but could be better, I'm going to put together my own trade. I'm not going to do it for every single suggestion, but I am going to try and put my own thoughts into these just a little bit more, starting with this episode. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. First up is a trade from Robert, and he says Mike Conley and Ivan Rabb for Dennis Smith Jr., Wes Matthews, and Dwight Powell, obviously from the Mavericks. And this is a really good one to start out with because this is something that me and MDJ kind of talked about on the podcast this past week, talking about some Memphis trade scenarios. This was one that we brought up. The idea was Dennis Smith Jr. as an asset to Memphis as a younger player, plus Wes Matthews to try and match the salaries, plus another player to try and match the very large salary for Mike Conley. And the idea here is obviously Memphis gets back some value for Conley. You could potentially put a second round pick in here as well just to give them another asset because Conley is still a very good player. They get Dennis Smith Jr. to kind of help them moving forward. They could definitely see him as a good young player as an asset for their rebuild, while Dallas continues to try and push towards the playoffs, which is something that they've been kind of hovering around but are starting to slide down the standings a little bit. And it's kind of a weird scenario because you would think that if a team's going to be trading for Mike Conley, given his age, given his contract situation, it would be more of a contender trying to put themselves over the top than a team that's on the fringes of making the playoffs like Dallas is. But it seems like they're very committed to doing that, and Mike Conley would definitely help them push towards a playoff appearance this season, so it provides benefit to them as well as providing benefit to Memphis. Like I said, Dallas could throw in a second round pick. They can't throw in their own first, obviously, because they owe it to Atlanta right now. But Dennis Smith Jr. is a good asset. Dwight Powell is pretty good. And then Wes Matthews is expiring, helps Memphis get out from under some salary. So I think it helps both teams. If I'm Dallas, though, I would be pretty hesitant to make this deal. One, because it seems like they've patched things up with Dennis Smith, and it looks like moving forward, they're going to try and develop him and make it work alongside Luka Doncic. And then the other thing is just the fact that Conley's contract is so big and he's getting up there in age, and it's not really someone that you want to have moving forward if you're in a position that Dallas is in, where you're not contending for a playoff spot necessarily. You're just kind of there, and you might be able to push late in the season, but it's not a great move long term. But again, if they're that committed to trying to make the playoffs, then I guess it does make sense from that standpoint. Next up, Stefan says Memphis would get Frank Kaminsky, Dwayne Bacon, Bismack Biyombo, and Charlotte's 2019 first round pick in exchange for Marc Gasol and Omri Caspi. And this is kind of weird that the first two trades are basically ones that I kind of had rolling around in my mind, whether it be from the podcast or just from playing around with the trade machine. This is exactly the same trade that I came up with in the trade machine when I was preparing for this episode, preparing to talk about some of my own trades. This is basically what I had in mind. I didn't put Omri Caspi on there just because I didn't need him to match the salaries, and the only other difference was the fact that I would have protected the 2019 first from Charlotte, either top 15 or lottery protected. And even though if you're Memphis, initially this doesn't seem like a ton of value, you basically get Dwayne Bacon and a first round pick and a little bit of cap relief because Biyombo's deal does run just as long as Gasol's does, but it's slightly cheaper. But you do get two players with some promise in Kaminsky and Bacon, then obviously the first round pick as well. And even though I think there's going to be a good amount of teams interested in Marc Gasol, I don't think his value is going to be all that high. I think Memphis is going to see him in very high value because of what he means to their team and to their fan base. But other teams I don't think are going to be all that willing to give up a ton of assets for someone like Marc Gasol. So I think this is a pretty good package for them. And then obviously if you're Charlotte, you're getting someone that you think can help you compete for a playoff spot moving forward. Gasol is likely to opt into his player option for around $24-25 million for next season, so they likely have him then. And even though they're not going to be pushing towards the top of the Eastern Conference standings or anything, if you're Charlotte and you can make the playoffs this year, it would be a nice step in the correct direction. I don't think this is going to move the needle too much on trying to bring Kemba back because I think he's pretty committed to staying, especially if you're going to give him a max or a super max. So that's not really relevant here. This is more just about them not really giving up a ton, with the exception obviously of their own first round pick, to get a player in Marc Gasol to help them try and make the playoffs this year, just to know that they made the playoffs essentially. Next up, Alessandro is getting a little bit complicated here with a 3-team deal, but I actually really like it. He says Miami gets Mike Conley and Wesley Matthews, Memphis gets Dennis Smith Jr., Tyler Johnson, Rodney McGruder, and a first-round pick from Miami, and Dallas gets Goran Dragic and Wayne Ellington. Now, when I say that I like this deal, it's not necessarily that I think everybody would say yes to this, because that's always kind of the issue in 3-team trades, is trying to find a reason for every team to be in the trade. But I do see benefit to each team in this, and that at least gets you part of the way there to each team saying yes. Miami gets Conley, who in my opinion is a slight upgrade at the point guard position from Goran Dragic. They get the Wesley Matthews contract in exchange for guys like Tyler Johnson, Rodney McGruder, Wayne Ellington. So that does help them out a little bit salary-wise, because Wes Matthews' deal does expire, and they definitely need help in the salary department, even though they're taking on the long-term money of Conley. But again, he's a slight upgrade at that position. In my opinion, Miami is probably the least likely of any of these teams to say yes to this deal, just because it doesn't provide them a ton of benefit, but I could still see it happening. For Memphis, this is a similar situation to what we talked about earlier with the Dallas trade, and the fact that they get Dennis Smith Jr. as a nice young asset. Tyler Johnson, I'm not all that excited about salary-wise, but he'll come off in a couple of years, and at least he's a solid player, and you're not paying him what you're paying Conley. Rodney McGruder is an interesting player, but it's probably just a rotation guy at this point. And then you get the first-round pick for Miami. There's no protections on it in this, but I'm sure there would be if this was a trade that actually happened. But again, it's a very similar situation to earlier in terms of what Memphis gets in exchange for Mike Conley. And then for Dallas, this is a trade that we've talked about in a similar way in the past, where they get a player like Goran Dragic in exchange for Dennis Smith Jr., someone that's going to help them make the playoffs, someone that has had international success with Luka Doncic, plays a little bit better on and off the ball than Dennis Smith does, and is just in general a better fit and a better veteran presence than obviously Dennis Smith is at this point in his career. And even though they do have to give up Wes Matthews, who's a solid player, they get Wayne Ellington, who's a really good shooter and someone that would be a rotation player for Dallas moving forward. And again, this could potentially push them towards playoff contention. But going back to what I said in the beginning of talking about this trade, my biggest issue here is the Miami Heat. They have to give up a first-round pick. They're taking on a large contract in Mike Conley, and they're giving up the most players in the deal just really to make the salary work. And I just don't really know how much this helps them. It helps them a little bit salary-wise in terms of the Wes Matthews expiring, but on the court it helps them slightly, and I just don't really see them giving up their own first-round pick. It doesn't specify a year, but I'm assuming this is 2019. I don't really see them giving up that kind of asset for what, in my opinion, is a very, very slight upgrade, both in terms of salary and in terms of the point guard position. For the other two teams, it makes sense. For Miami, I would probably say no. And last up now is a trade that I actually came up with myself for Marc Gasol, because when I looked through my mentions on Twitter and some of the comments in past Trade Machine episodes, I didn't see a ton of Marc Gasol trade scenarios that I really liked that weren't to Charlotte, and I didn't want to talk about two different Charlotte trades. So this one is actually one for Utah. And in this trade, the Grizzlies would get Derek Favors, Thabo Sefolosha, and Tony Bradley in exchange for Marc Gasol, and likely probably a second-round pick, depending on how motivated Memphis is to move Marc Gasol, what the market is like for him. Initially, this does not seem like a ton of value, so probably would be a second. Maybe you could push the Jazz for a first, but if it was me, I would throw in a second and stop right there. And I'll admit that this is a weird trade on both sides. It doesn't seem like a ton of value for Gasol, but depending on the circumstances, if they're not getting a ton of trade offers for him and they really want to move him at the trade deadline, maybe Utah could stretch his value a little bit and try and get him for what is probably below market value for a player of his caliber. And if you're the Jazz, this is also kind of a weird fit. You've obviously already got Rudy Gobert, so why would you want to trade for Marc Gasol? But he's someone that I think can play the four a little bit in terms of spacing and just provides them really good minutes at essentially the backup 5 spot. And I understand that that is just a weird scenario to be in, but you've got two of the better defensive centers in the league moving forward into the postseason. Derek Favors, in my opinion, is still just continuing to be a super weird fit in Utah, so it's not like you're giving up someone that's a good fit at the 4 for someone that's a weird fit at the 4-5 in Gasol. Favors is already struggling, in my opinion at least, to fit into that mold. Tony Bradley is an okay asset for Memphis moving forward, as potentially a nice starting 5-man. And then again, if you throw the pick in, you might have to stretch it to a first, but if I'm Utah, I would just say these three guys, you get cap relief and Favors, who you can waive next year as non-guaranteed money. Sefolosha is an expiring deal, an okay young player moving forward in Tony Bradley, and a second-round pick. Take it or leave it. That's how I would phrase it to Memphis. And I will admit that this is not an ideal circumstance for Memphis, but again, just when I went through all the different trade scenarios that I could for Marc Gasol, I just didn't see a ton of high-level value and interest for him. He's up there in age. His contract isn't awful because it's this year and then next year, assuming he opts in to his player option. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of teams that could be interested. I just don't think there's a lot of teams that would want to give up anything hugely significant for him. So I think if he does end up getting moved, it's going to be something closer to this kind of value than it would be for, you know, multiple first-round picks or anything crazy like that. So really, maybe he doesn't get moved at this deadline. Maybe they wait till next year if he opts in and uses him as an expiring contract. But it's just tough to find deals with his size salary for him and Conley. Honestly, it's tough to find deals where they're getting a ton of value. So if they're that motivated to move him, it might end up being a trade like this. But with all that said, that is going to be the end of today's episode of NBA Trade Machine, and I thank you all very much for watching. Like always, if you have any of your own trade ideas you'd like me to take a look at, you can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or in the comments section of this video, and I will absolutely take a look. But once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.